After many requests for bite-sized videos, you got it. We're going to be talking about the top 5 simple arguments against the doctrine of the papacy, particularly the Vatican I doctrine of the papal monarchy. And my first point is just very simple. If the dogma of papal infallibility as defined at Vatican I is always true, was always true, will always be true, the very foundation upon which the church was built, as Roman Catholics typically claim, we always knew this was the case. And why did it take 19 centuries for the church to clarify and say what this doctrine is? In fact, wouldn't it have been one of the first doctrines that was proclaimed as dogmatic? Wouldn't it have been in the creed? It's not even in the creed. And yet this is supposed to be the foundation of the one true church. If it was a universal, clear, apostolic, Petrine charism and doctrine, then there wouldn't have been a need for all of these disputes, all of these ecumenical councils called by emperors, not popes. There wouldn't have been ecumenical councils that condemned popes, like Honorius. There wouldn't have been an ecumenical council that solved the so-called crisis of the Great Western Schism when you had multiple people claiming to be the true pope. And so what do we have there? Constance, a council over the pope. And yet, within a few generations, the pope reasserts his supremacy over the councils. These are all clear, known, classic historical examples that run completely contrary to the supposed obvious claim, right, that everybody from the earliest days throughout the whole world knew the supremacy of the Roman bishop meant Vatican I. That's the Vatican I claim. And so all that's necessary really is to show that that isn't the case. If that isn't the case, then Vatican I is not true when it claims that that was always the case. As a rejoinder to that, typically there's an argument made about the evolution of doctrine. Now, the irony is that documents like Pacendi of Pius X explicitly state that there is no evolution of doctrine, and that's a modernist tenet. And yet Roman Catholics will appeal to doctrine itself undergoing an evolutionary development to justify the fact that, admittedly, this was not the practice of the church in the first 1,000 years. I'll leave this essay, by the way, down below. You can get the longer arguments to this effect. An easier way to see that the Roman Catholic Church is not the true church is the papacy has now basically confirmed with no ambiguity that it does not teach the doctrine of the death penalty. Prior to this modern reassessment, according to John Paul II and now Francis, the death penalty was classed as part of natural justice, aka natural law. Now, even in Roman Catholic theology, they don't believe that the Pope can undo, change, or alter natural law, much less supernatural law. So the idea that this could be done away with or changed, which it absolutely has, beyond dispute, right, as something that's no longer viable for the modern church. This is another proof that the Roman Catholic positions and dogmas change. The true church and her doctrines, her dogmas cannot change. So I think this is one of the strongest modern examples of the papacy as an evolving doctrine. Next, I would point to the papacy as a universal temporal power. Nobody in the first 1,000 years of the church taught this. The infamous bull of 1302 of Boniface VIII, Unum Sanctum, is what really pushes this into the fore. So this is a medieval Renaissance papal doctrine, eventually. And this allows for there to be the accumulation of much wealth. Eventually, this allows for there to be the Vatican Bank. I don't remember Jesus telling Peter that he should establish a global usury-based bank, but rather the church is a spiritual institution. There's nothing like this in the first 1,000 years, and this is why the church basically had to, in the West, rely on forgeries. The donation of Constantine, other famous forgeries, had to back up this absurd claim to universal temporal supremacy. And really this just lends credence to the critique of St. Justin Popovich that this is a humanist institution. Now, another argument is that the modern papacy itself, at least the papacy of the post-Vatican II era, what most Roman Catholics acknowledge as the legitimate papacy, most even traditional Catholics admit that the Eastern churches, as in terms of the Orthodox, have retained their faith, their succession, and their spirituality for the last millennium without the papacy. So if we've maintained our faith without the papacy for the last 1,000 years, without the communion of the Roman See, that itself is an attestation to the fact that the church does not require the papacy to exist, to know and recognize truth. Beyond that, I would say the canons of the councils themselves, not just one canon, not just a couple councils. I'll leave a link below to the canons of all the ecumenical councils specifically that we picked out that reflect the mind of all of those councils, right? That specifically are contrary to Vatican I's doctrine of the papacy. How can it be the case that Vatican I was always true, was always known, if basically the mind of the church at every ecumenical council is enacting all of these canons contrary to the attitude and doctrine of Vatican I? It's very easy to see this, right? Not just Canon 6 of Nicaea, but many canons throughout the ecumenical councils are directly contrary to the claims of Vatican I. Now, in the case, as I mentioned earlier, of somebody like Pope Honorius, we have many mentions, right? It's not like it's just some disputed question about the Sixth Council. No, rather, his condemnation is found in the Acts of the Council, near the beginning. His letters were ordered to be burned, Pope Honorius. He is considered in the Seventh Council and in the Synodicon as also heretics to be rejected, along with other heretics. And so the anathematization of Pope Honorius proves that a council can declare and is above a pope. A council can declare popes to have apostatized and become heretics. And again, this is completely contrary to the entire attitude of Vatican I's post-first millennium evolution doctrine, that no one can judge the first see, nor is anyone superior to the first see. As I said, right, Pope Leo II confirmed the decrees of this council and expressly states that he rejects and anathematizes Honorius. The Eighth Council admits that you cannot change the creed. And I'll leave the link to the Dragas article below. So if you can't change the creed, and that's admitted by the Pope at the time of St. Photius, then this should not be an issue, right? I would add, too, that there's other issues that are, I think, pretty glaring. The Chieti document of Rome, right, approved by the papacy, as recently admitted, as well as famous Catholic writers, apologists, that the Vatican I attitude was not the attitude of the first 1,000 years of the church. Right? Here it is right here. Here's this. Here's the document. You can go read it. I'll put that below. And the Chieti document as well has said that, look, we have to admit that the praxis of the church for the first 1,000 years was conciliarism. It was collegiality. It was not the papal monarchy as characterized by Vatican I. And in fact, if you know, right, Cardinal Ratzinger, Principles of Catholic Theology, and he has this quote that I'll include. So here's Pope Benedict XVI, Principles of Catholic Theology, where he admits this. And then the same book later on, pages 216 and 217, admits the same point. Now, it doesn't matter what the dogmatic status of these writings is, because this is admitting the position of orthodoxy. Indeed, Father Francis Dvornik, the famous Uniate, his book, The Photian Schism, has essentially admitted all of the arguments of the East. The Eastern Uniate Roman Catholics revere all of these so-called schismatic and heretical people that the Orthodox Church holds up, that the Latins, the Roman Catholic Church, anathematizes. So that alone tells you that the Roman Catholic Church contains conflicting, contradictory creeds and confessions. Therefore, it is not the true church. In fact, wouldn't we expect the true church to use and exemplify the very anathematization ceremony, at least that's exemplified at the Seventh Council, the anathema service.
Неисповедующим сердцем и устами, что Святой Дух существенно и ипостасно исходит только от Отца, яко рече Христос в своем Евангелии.
Well, post-Vatican II, the Roman Catholic Church doesn't even do an anathema service. In fact, it doesn't accept the Synodicon in its anathema service. So if your church doesn't do what the church of the first millennium, the first 700 years did, you're not the true church. The final point, I would add that the post-Vatican II papacy is engaged in progressively more egregious versions of apostasy via their so-called ecumenism. Now, the calling together of different professing so-called Christians or groups to try to come to an agreement on doctrine is not what the ecumenism movement is about. Ecumenism is about watering down and not proselytizing or converting people, which is precisely what the Great Commission is all about. In fact, Francis didn't just honor other religions like Islam, which are, of course, antichrist religions that John says anyone denying Christ coming in the flesh is of the spirit of Antichrist. Francis actually goes into the mosques and prays towards Mecca. And lest you think that this was something unique to the wild, clownish fancies of Francis, no, in fact, it was Benedict XVI who had done the exact same thing. But Francis did take it to a new level when it comes to the recent visit to the Iraqi ziggurat, which is a site for, of course, human pagan sacrifice in the ancient world. Ziggurats are, of course, known to be locations of tremendous pagan practice and degeneracy, and yet at the same time, this amazing event included, we read, prayer services with not just so-called Jews and Muslims and sons of Abraham, so-called, but in fact with Yazidis. Yazidis are a Gnostic sectarian group that explicitly reference and revere the fallen angel, Satan. So this is the first time that Mandean Sabian Yazidis were invited to a inter-religious prayer service headed by none other than Francis himself. This is, of course, a complete rejection of the Christian religion in both faith and practice.